Good afternoon or good evening. Why don't we start? My name is Malcolm Salter. I'm going to do some introductions this afternoon. I'm some sort of a faculty associate at the Safra Center, and been there for about 3 years, and have spent the last 45 years across the river at the Harvard Business School. I want to say just before we start that our respective valets did not coordinate today. All three of us have bow ties. It's purely coincidental, but that's serendipity. Serendipity works sometime. So I want to just make a few quick introductions before we go to the format, which I think will be very interesting, that we have designed for today. And I just want to say a few words about Robert Bob Kaiser. And there is some background here, actually, that probably Robert doesn't know about. But I just want to say, in terms of his biography, it's the kind of biography that really makes me, anyway, feel very comfortable, you know, with the Fourth Estate. It's really quite a remarkable history, and I think it's quite interesting because we have at the center some outstanding men and women from the Fourth Estate as well, who are plowing different kinds of careers, you know, in journalism. So I think that contrast is interesting. But this is just wonderfully classical. And it started when Bob was an undergraduate at Yale, and he went down to intern at the Washington Post, and in a sense, he never left. In fact, he hasn't ever left. And he's done a whole realm of things which are really quite remarkable. And you'll see why I feel a great deal of comfort as I just kind of tick through them, because I'm not going to tell you very much, but I could tell you a lot. I could tell you, for example, that after he was a summer intern, he became a correspondent in London very quickly after joining the paper for 3 or 4 years in London. And after that, he bounced back to the city desk for another 3 years or so in Washington. He then was a correspondent in Saigon for 2 or 3 years. He then went off to Moscow, and out of that came 3 of his 8 books. And this is when I actually first ran into your work, because Bob's wife and my wife were high school classmates, and she's a co-author of one of the books. So when that book came out, we of course picked it up. And so salutes to Hannah from us. Then there was, back in the U.S., 7 years of covering labor, the U.S. Senate, the 1980 presidential campaign, the Reagan administration, and then a big break came in the flow. But it wasn't a break. It was really more flow than a break, which is he became associate editor of the Post, and that was quickly followed by assistant managing editor, and then a deputy managing editor, and then in the late 90s, for most of the 90s, served as the paper's managing editor. So you can see the arc of this career is amazing, and it in 2 respects. One, you can imagine all the stories you know. I mean, it's just incredible. And then that also reflects sort of a portfolio of skills, you know, to kind of manage a whole horde of investigative journalists, which must be a story in itself. So I said there are 8 books. There are 2 that we're going to talk about today. I want to say, I'm not going to say anything substantively about the books, because I think that will be part of the interchange. There's a book on the Act of Congress, of course, which is about the sort of the legislative history, very interesting, of the Dodd-Frank bill. And if you want to see, if you can get this off on demand, take a look at the Charlie Rose show with you and Chris Dodd together. It was. Oh, was it? I didn't see that. I didn't see. Yeah, it was really a very interesting show, because it reflects on a very interesting skill, which is access. Getting access to write about the things that you wrote about, both in this book and in the book So Damn Much Money, is really quite remarkable. And without talking about the substance, and so I'm going to plug about your book here. Particularly the book on So Damn Much Money is a great story, and it's perfectly written. Because what it is, it's a history of one lobbying firm, Cassidy and Company, which becomes the backbone to a more broadly based book about what's going on in the environment. And it's the interplay back and forth between the specific and the general, which I think is really fantastic. Bob is associate editor and senior correspondent today, and we are really very, very happy to have you here today. I just want to say where we all know Larry, who's our leader at the center, and he is, I want to mention this for a reason, the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law and Leadership at the Harvard Business School, and I've always pondered, at the law school, what did I say? Business school. Sorry. Well, that gets into the point I wanted to make, actually, because the title of Professor of Law and Leadership at the Harvard Law School, I've always wondered about the leadership part of it. That always strikes me as a very interesting part. And as I think about that, and when friends of mine at the business school ask me about, well, what's going on at the center and kind of what's Larry doing and what's he like, I only can answer that, you know, in sort of Trinitarian terms. Because Larry is not only a legal scholar, he's not only a social scientist, but the third piece of it that's very interesting to me as well is the aspect that I have labeled Tom Paine. So when I describe Larry to others, and I put this third one in, it's a kind of a litmus test. First of all, the people remember who Tom Paine was. It's always interesting, and when their eyes glaze over, I know that that's a statement. But what was so interesting about Tom Paine, and why I use that as also a descriptor, is that Tom Paine in January 1776, wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense. And for all the work that Larry does, I think it reflects a lot of common sense when you get to the end. And as a matter of fact, I think it's a lot of uncommon common sense. The second thing is that Tom Paine was a fighter for independence, and that's a word that's very dear to you, Larry. Independence in so many different ways. And also, Tom Paine was not only an author, but he was a political activist. So I think this term, leadership, resonates a lot of ideas to me, and so it's just great working together. It's wonderful. So the format's going to be, there's going to be a conversation, and it's an interview for about 45 minutes, and then there'll be a sort of a free-for-all where everybody can kind of dive in and go to work. And oh yeah, and sign books. Oh, okay, I did good. I'm all for that one. Good, okay. Thanks very much, Larry. This is great.
So thank you, Mal. It is a good question. What are you at the center? I mean, he's of course introducer, but he's of course a emeritus faculty member. He's kind of the conscience of the center, brings us back to reality, but he has been the hardest working faculty member around our project, and we're incredibly grateful to you for everything you've done to help us think about this project. So I'm happy to share a bow tie with both Mal and with Bob Kaiser, whose work was really quite central in my own thinking about how to frame and talk about this problem. But as Mal suggested in his introduction, it's a little embarrassing to have to talk about this part of your career, given the range of your career. Mal ticked through the particular incidents, but didn't really tie them to historical moments. So you were in DC during the era of Mad Men, I mean, where Mad Men is right now. Then you were in Saigon just after Tet, and then you were in Moscow during the Kissinger years. And of course, you know, we could spend weeks talking, more interestingly perhaps for the history of the world, about those subjects than about the particular nagging, annoying issue we've got to talk about tonight, which is the United States Congress. So we're going to focus on the particular nagging, annoying issue. And the reason this conversation suggested itself to me was that if you've read both of these books, really extraordinary books, both of them, the surface, they feel like they're written by two completely different people. Because the first book, So Damn Much Money, leaves you believing that the institution of Congress is hopeless. There's nothing more to be done. But the second book is an extraordinary story of how the institution rallied in this important moment to produce quite substantial legislation addressing the financial crisis, which of course we celebrated celebrate's probably the wrong word, but we remembered its 5th anniversary just this week. So I want to start with the first book, because one of the most important lessons that came, at least for me, out of that book was the recognition of how the institution had changed. The focus on so damn much money echoes for many people with the recognition that money has, of course, always been part of the political process. But the story that you tell here is really about how the character of and the role of money inside of the system changed. So I wonder if you could start by just helping us understand a little bit about how you would characterize the rise of the significance of money in this.
First, let me thank you and the Center for this invitation. I'm delighted to be here and see a full house and some wonderful old friends. The world did change, and I was on station. I saw it happen, which has really been interesting. I covered the Senate for the Post in the 70s. Somebody published a book a year ago called The Last Great Senate, which was about the Senate of 76 to 80, which is the Senate I covered. I dispute the thesis in some detail, but it's a pretty good book. And it's a reminder that we had in the not so distant past a lot of senators who were steeped in and cared deeply about policy issues and knew what they were working on and knew why they were working on it. The world begins to change, in my view, which is, as I write in the book, in the late 70s, Proposition 13, the older people here remember, in California, a tax limitation amendment passed by initiative, which, in my opinion, destroyed the public sector of California largely. Stephen Greenblatt is here, or was. He can tell you what happened at the University of Berkeley. But California used to have the best public schools in America, and they've been pretty well destroyed, largely. Anyway, this was the beginning of a big change in the public attitudes. Ronald Reagan's election was part of this too. The Tea Party is a part of it as well, I think. We can talk about that later. But for Congress, this coincides with the discovery that you can win election to the House and the Senate with television commercials based on polling made by slick madmen, people from that world. And it worked. This was the scary thing. So you had very slick operators who themselves made a lot of money doing this, who figured out how to elect people to these jobs, often people that had absolutely no policy interests or qualifications for them. But if they could raise the dough, if they could raise the big money, which by today's standards is picayune, but in those days was startling. I'm one book removed, so I don't have all that statistics in my head now, but roughly speaking, Senate campaigns in the 60s and early 70s cost $100,000, $200,000. A really contentious one might cost $800,000. Well, last time around, we had several $40 million Senate races. This escalates all the time. It changes the nature of the people that want to do the job. I think one of the secrets of the modern Congress, relevant to both these books, is how much time a member has to spend on the telephone, calling strangers, literally begging for money. These guys go around, and gals, with lists in their pockets that have been prepared for them, often by their fundraising consultant. They got names, telephone numbers, spouses' names, kids' names. You call these people up, hey, Joe, how's Mabel? How's Willie and Ann doing? Listen, I'm running again next time. I need your help. It's a horrible thing to have to do. It's so demeaning. And there are very few members now who are immune from it. They all have to do it. They spend 1 day a week, 2 days a week doing this all the time. There used to be a break. You used to be able to run for just 6 months or so in the year you were up. Every 6 years for a senator, every 2 for a congressman. Not now. You're doing it all the time. You used to live in Washington when you were a member of the Congress. You used to live in a subculture of people whose kids went to the same schools, whose wives did things together in a day and era when wives didn't do work outside the home, who really got to know each other. We had dinner parties in Georgetown, you've heard about them, where they really got to like each other and know each other. An enormously important grease for the system, which is now gone. Newt Gingrich, who is personally the great villain of all this for me, we can talk about that too, but he insisted after the great victory he won in 1994 that his members not live in Washington. You can have a small pied-à-terre in Washington. You must stay in your district. Why? Because he'd seen people defeated with slick TV campaigns that accused them of going Washington, forgetting where they came from, losing touch with home, and so on. So these and other factors contribute to an enormous change in the culture. There's been a big change in the general culture too, obviously we can talk about that, but it's very vividly reflected in the Congress. And so we have a very different kind of a Congress now, as we're about to be reminded. There's about to be, I think, a great catastrophe in Washington. It's going to cause all kinds of havoc. I think it's unavoidable that we're probably going to go into default, which is just stunning to me, because the ideological persuasion of these new members of the House, the Republican right, is going to sweep away the old constraints. It's really going to be a showdown. So,
well, but what's interesting and complicated about the story is a bunch of things are changing at the same time.
Yes.
So one of the things you identify is the change in the technology of campaigns. So campaigns go from relatively simple projects to very complicated media polling enterprises, and that's driving the demand for campaign dollars up dramatically. But the second thing that's happening, and in your second book you nail this, I think, quite directly. You can say Newt Gingrich is the problem, and I would agree with you that there's no man. But yeah, no man is more responsible for the current architecture of Congress, or in the history of Congress, than perhaps Madison, right? But Madison was for the good, and Gingrich was not for the good. But the point is,
just our opinion.
Yeah, no, well, no, it's fact. I looked it up. You can check on Google. But the point is that Gingrich has this major effect because all of a sudden the two parties become relatively competitive. So after the '94 election, basically every single election cycle, Congress is up for grabs. And both parties realize they've really got to scramble to raise the money for these extremely expensive campaigns to regain control. So corporation scholars would say there's a control premium here. Every single election cycle, there's a fight over the control premium of our government, which is extremely valuable for the entity that you focus on so carefully in the first book, the lobbying industry. Because now the lobbying industry realizes there's something to sell here. Now, part of the history, which I think I certainly didn't know, and I think is really important to bring out, is the innovation of earmarks, which again, we kind of think this must have been here from time immemorial, but you really tie it in its modern form to just about 1976 with Cassidy and Cassidy Associates.
Started nearby.
At Tufts, right. So they begin to develop this particular way of producing value for clients. And the clients are not Exxon or IBM. The clients are universities, public institutions that find this as a really effective way to bring money into their institutions, at least given that they're not able to bring it in the old-fashioned way, namely by competing on the merits. So now, did Cassidy understand at this time the gold mine that he had tripped into, or was it a while before the industry really recognized just how valuable this new product was?
I think it was gradual. I think people saw, it's a Boston story. Jean Mayer was essentially a nutritionist, was the president of Tufts. He wanted to create, as his first big thing as president of Tufts in the mid-'70s, a human nutrition research institute, which exists today down in Boston and Chinatown. And he went, he got a letter from Cassidy's partner, actually, a guy called Ken Schlossberg, who I hoped might be here today, but I don't see he's here. Ken had worked with Cassidy on the staff of the Hunger Committee in the Senate, and they developed this specialty. So their first big client was Jean Mayer. He got him money. They helped get money for this nutrition center. A guy called John Silber became president of Boston University. He saw what Mayer had gotten away with. He started to cultivate Cassidy. He became ultimately Cassidy's biggest client, I think, over the years. BU raised millions and millions of dollars this way. Interestingly, both institutions had a very important ally, a good old-fashioned liberal called Ted Kennedy, who loved earmarks. And that was one of the things about earmarks. They were good for everybody, except the people that applied and didn't get them. But everybody who got one was happy with their congressman and senator, whoever it was that helped. And it was a mutually supportive feeding society that everybody got fat. So this is it changed the world, but it built over time. And it got so bad that they've now had to pull back from it. And they've made an issue in both houses. We're not doing earmarks anymore because of people like me pointing out and bringing attention to it.
You and the Tea Party.
And the Tea Party, yeah.
Yeah, you're ally of the Tea Party here. So, and one of the consequences some people worry is that this mechanism, which was really the grease in the wheels of Congress that made it possible for Congress to get things done because members, in effect, could be bought off with these earmarks, removing this might be part of what's explaining the inability of the leaders to hold members together anymore. Like there's nothing anymore really to be fighting over or not fighting over.
What holds them together now is the winning and losing.
Right.
So the party discipline is greater today, I think, than at any time in American history. You have fewer split votes, higher percentages of homogenized unanimous or nearly unanimous support for everything. That's very much a function of this. And but also you have a decline of interest in actual government, which is huge. And an important, really a cardinal feature of the Tea Party is how few of the Tea Party members of the House have experience in government or really care about government. They are quite proudly anti-government. They want to shrink the government. They don't want to be involved with the government. This is a new thing for us too.
Right, and this again, though, goes hand in hand with the incredibly competitive election system because I saw Chris Murphy, who's the new senator from Connecticut, youngest member of the Senate, describe how when they in their office send out an email that touts the great work the Democratic Party is doing, it raises a tiny amount of money. But when they send out an email demonizing the Republicans, it raises tons of money. And it quickly becomes the story that both parties have to adopt, that the other side is the devil. And so when you're calling the other side the devil, it's hard to then shift into, well, let's compromise and make a deal to make something work. So the whole permanent war mentality that's necessary to raise the funds to continue to make it so you have a chance at being in the majority next time around has this consequence of making it impossible for Congress to actually sit down and deal with anything consistent with that framework.
I think that's right.
And you say, so at the end of one of this, you pull this together, if defeating your political enemy is what's most important, then writing effective, intelligent legislation will inevitably decline in importance, or at least importance to them, not decline in importance to us, right? We're still pretty much committed to important legislation, but they seem to be disconnected from this.
We used to have members, lots of members, never probably a literal majority. I covered the Senate from 77 to 80. I would say there were 40, 45 senators then who knew policy, who loved policy, who cared about issues. I don't think there's 20 today in that category. Although there's been more lately. It's interesting, there's a new group of younger people that are encouraging. But the victory of political warfare as the name of the game, has really changed the nature of both institutions.
Yeah, and in the second book we're talking about, you reflect upon Chris Dodd's lamenting again and again about the change of the character of this institution. You write the debates Dodd remembered were about policy, the debates within the Democratic caucus. Now most of the heated discussion was about politics. Dodd was dismayed by the fact that many Democratic caucus sessions were devoted to discussions of fundraising and partisan warfare. Pragmatic moderation was what made the place work, he thought, but now everything works against that moderation. And so you can't escape that, it feels like, or at least it seems, given the continued pressure for them to be in this permanent war situation.
There's another interesting anecdote, which to means a lot to Dodd. When Dodd was a young senator, and he's not a paragon, I mean, he's had his problems too, but he's a good guy at the end of the day, I think. When he was a young senator, he always ate lunch in a dining room next to the formal Senate dining room, some of you may know, which was just for senators. They had one long table, and he said you go in there any day in the early 80s when he started doing this, and there'd be 15, 20, 25 senators having lunch there, schmoozing with each other. He said, I went in there the other day, there was nobody there, literally nobody. Nobody has lunch in the senator's only dining room, because there's no community, there's no sense of shared experience.
Yeah. Last year we had John Sarbanes, who's the son of Paul Sarbanes and fourth-term congressman from Maryland, speak. He describes how in his 6 years, he told me this in his third term, in his 6 years in Congress, he's had lunch with 6 members of Congress. He says, because if you have time for lunch, you have time to raise money, and if you have time to raise money, why would you have lunch, right? So this culture, which of course for most of them is the only culture they've known, because the Dodd you're describing is a person who was there in the 80s and in the early 90s, and that's of course a very tiny fraction of this current Congress.
And he's my age. I mean, he's a geezer.
Right, right. Now what should we call it? The last time I was given the chance to interview somebody, I got to interview a felon. This is a step up for me.
I didn't know you knew about that.
So Jack Abramoff, who his work now I think is quite powerful and interesting about how to reform the system. But what he called the system is what I want to call the system. He called the system corrupt. I mean, you quote him as saying it's a system of legalized bribery, all of its bribery, every bit of it. And then at the other extreme, Leon Panetta, who in your first book, you highlight as quite a virtuous person, one of the rare members who retired and didn't go to become a lobbyist, but went back to California to become a professor. What could be wrong with that? He describes it as legalized bribery, become part of the culture about how the place operates. Is it corrupt? Do you think of it as corruption, or is it more complicated than that?
No, it is corruption, but it's more complicated than financial corruption. It's deeply it's spiritual corruption, it's intellectual corruption. Things are ruled out now in the modern Congress because no one would ever give $10 to anybody who was in favor of that, which takes off the table an awful lot of interesting ideas because there's just no financial backing for them. It's that kind of thing. So I think it's terribly, terribly corrupted, but it can be very subtle and complicated.
Yeah, now
Barney Frank is an interesting example, excuse me. Barney, who I've known since we were kids, we were literally delegates to the National Student Congress together in 1961. Barney took money from people who, in my opinion, he never should have taken money from, but he did so probably quite accurately, firm in the knowledge and the conviction that he was not corruptible by these people. If they thought they were going to get something in return for giving him money, God bless them, let them think it. They're not going to get it. And as far as I know, one of Barney's close friends and associates is here today. We can ask him too. But as far as I know, he never did a favor for anybody for $10 or $10,000. It's just not his style. But that's really unusual now. Most of them are corruptible, not in the classic, I'm going to get you off the hook, I'm going to get something for your company, whatever, things like that. It's much more subtle, but it's no less corrosive.
Yeah, now you quote, it's a very interesting quote from Tony Coelho, who was obviously part of the change of the system too, but you say, he says, quote, I think it's bad, but not legally corrupt. The press always tries to say that you've been bought out, but I don't buy that. I just don't think it's true. I think the process buys you out, but I don't think that you individually have been bought out or that you seek or that you seek it out. I think that's a big difference. Now, what is he talking? What's he trying to say here?
Is Dr. Freud in the house? He's talking about his own attempt to rationalize what I hope you and I would think of as the unrationalizable. I mean, it's these are very slim distinctions he's trying to make here, as though it's meaningful. I don't. They are corrupted, and they're corrupted profoundly because, like him, they won't even recognize it.
Yeah, yeah. So he's described by Jackson, I think you say, as saying a law-abiding player in an immoral system. So he's just living by the rules within a system that everybody understands as immoral. Okay. Now, the consequence of this system, at least at the end of your first book, seemed to be, summarized by Hegel. Hegel says, not the Hegel, but Chuck Hegel,
The Secretary of Defense
says. Healthcare, immigration reform, environment, you name the big issues today. We have not been able to move on any of them because the power of the process, the power of the special interest. And the prediction would seem to be that nothing could happen. But then something happened. So Dodd-Frank comes along as a big counter example to this exaggerated claim that nothing could ever pass in this kind of Congress, or nothing sensible could pass. You say of this statute, the statute does demonstrate that Congress still can work, italics in your original, and it shows how, but only in extreme circumstances, so extreme that they are unlikely to occur for a long time. Now, in what sense should we take solace in the fact that in this most extreme crisis, Congress was able to pass a pretty substantial bill? What is the optimism you really feel out of this?
Well, first of all, this was a freak. We had, in the modern era, we had 4 years of Democratic control. And that's a first. Well, we had 4 years of Republican control, 1 or 6 earlier, but one-party control is very rare. That's what made this possible. And they had big majorities. They had remember they had a 60-vote majority in the Senate. They lost it in the right here in Massachusetts in the special election. But Scott Brown luckily was available to Chris Todd at the end. And that's one of the fun stories in this book, is how Barney and Chris got Scott Brown to come along and save the Dodd-Frank bill. But, whose merits, I think it's a pretty good bill, but we're not going to know. And I don't expect to live long enough to see the big test of Dodd-Frank. The students in the room will, and we'll find out. But Frank and Dodd would say the same thing. They wrote a lot of new stuff in this bill, which they hope will work in the future, but you can't be sure. You just don't know. But I think, so it was freaky that way. And you've said this to me before, and I always cringe a little because I don't think my view changed. I think circumstances changed. Big majorities for the Democrats, which Obama himself benefited from the same phenomenon. The bombs got thrown out. As always in American politics, the winners misinterpret the result. And, this means they're all for us and they want to do everything we want to do. No. In the American context, it almost always means we hate those sons of bitches, we want them out. Throw the bums out, get the new bums in, which is what happens. But they're in love with themselves because they've won, but nobody else is in love with them, as the Democrats learned rudely 2 years later when they lost the majority. So it's a very complicated process. But I did not intend that you or anyone else come away optimistic from this account. Mm-hmm. This book, the new book about Dodd-Frank, which isn't really about Dodd-Frank. I don't want to discourage potential readers. Dodd-Frank is a really complicated, fat bill. But this is a book that's meant to be about the culture of the Congress and who these people are and how they do what they do and why they do what they do. But this was a freak. It was and it was, the crisis was absolutely critical, and still it barely got through. Yeah, almost lost.
Yeah. No, but the other point, which the book I think nicely brings out, is the point you just made a minute ago, how certain ideas are just off the table. It's a very conservative bill. You say no serious effort was made either to call to account the profligate institutions and individuals who contributed to the crash, or to meaningfully alter the financial landscape. Confronted by disaster and panic, the relevant officials in the executive branch and in Congress seem to share the same instinct: keep the old ship afloat. And you recount, this is really quite a moving, speech by Harkin, one of the few real liberals left at the time. He says on the floor, I defy anyone here in this, not on the floor, in the conference committee, I defy anyone on Wall Street or in New York to show me one person, one trader, one whiz kid who lost their home, their money, and everything, and were put out in the street because of what happened in the Great Crash. But we can show you hundreds of thousands of Americans who lost their homes, lost their business, are out on the street because of what Wall Street did, and it's up to us to make it right. But as you say, Harkin captured a reality that was rarely mentioned. Something truly awful had happened in these previous 2 years, victimizing millions of Americans, but very few of the perpetrators. Those victims rarely made more than a cameo appearance in the arcane debates over derivatives and the Volcker rule. Now, that reality, I think, is undeniable, and I think people outside of Washington reflect on it all the time. What's interesting is how inside Washington, it's almost not even noticed, right? So when Barney Frank, who is a big hero in the book, says again and again, and I heard him say it directly, the banks didn't get anything, Tom Harkin would say, well, only because everything interesting was pushed off the table. You know, the banks didn't get what lots of sensible people thought they should have gotten, which was broken up and radically re-regulated in a way that seemed to be impossible to imagine because of the influence that you were describing.
Yeah, that's well said. I don't, this, you know, nobody's been indicted, nobody's gone to jail. It's astounding. This really, if you read the accounts of what happened, it's really stunning. Everybody got away with it. That's
yeah, everybody got away with that. And then you're right, this book is not just about Dodd-Frank. I mean, it is extraordinary in its capturing the details of this Congress. So you report Kennedy saying 95% of the gritty work of legislating is done by staff now, and that's a substantial change. Indeed, I heard Bill Gates, I'm not supposed to repeat this, so don't tell anybody he said this, but Bill Gates described, he was in the Senate as a page in the early 1960s. And he said, I used to read every single bill. Now, that's not because he's a speed reader. He wasn't reading 2,000-page bills. It's because every bill was relatively short. It was relatively small. And that's because a bunch of the lifting was done by actual members who weren't going to write 3,000-page bills. But that's radically changed now. It's shifted down to the staff. And that change is troubling if you begin to think of who the staff is and who the staff wants to be. Where are they going? Are they staying on Capitol Hill for their whole career, or are they moving down to downtown, to K Street very quickly as soon as it makes sense for them to cash in? Now, you must have a sense of this difference in the staff.
yes, although, you know, it's awfully easy from Cambridge, Mass. to pass judgment on good people who aren't, you know, criminally culpable. I wrote about this in the So Damn Much Money. A lot of the lobbyists in Washington are very good citizens. They coach the Little League, they go to church. They're not bad people. They're in a crummy business, a slimy business in my opinion. But these things are all really complicated now. So I hate to be very judgmental about it. And you have, in the new book, the Dodd-Frank book, the two heroic figures, and I love them both, I confess, are women. A woman called Amy Friend, both lawyers. Amy was general counsel, or special counsel, senior counsel to the Senate Banking Committee. And Jean Roslanowicz, who was the staff director of the House Financial Services Committee, Barney's committee. They're friends of one another. Jean was older and is sort of a patron and helper to, a mentor to Amy. They're very fond of one another. They're extremely good citizens, very hardworking, gave up their private lives for 2 years to do this bill. Jean is nearly my age, and she's really retired. Amy has gone to work as the general counsel of the Comptroller of the Currency. She's a real regulator now and an important figure trying to implement the bill. But so therefore they're both exceptions to the rule, which you alluded to, which is that most senior staff now go from senior staff positions to lobbying positions because the money is just irresistible. If you're the staff director of a committee, Today you're making, I think it is 167.5 or 172.5, something like that. In other words, the starting salary of a graduate of this school in New York or Washington. If you're a good lobbyist or working in one of the big lobbying firms, you're starting at 750, and you can go way up. So, and you got kids in college, and that's out of control now, and so on. So it's just irresistible. It's profoundly corrupting, for sure, but it doesn't mean that they're all horrible, evil people. It's just that's what we have now. I want to start reading more about the last years of Rome, because I sometimes feel that must be something like where we are, but I don't know enough to say.
And I mean, when I did my book, which I haven't mentioned yet tonight, so here it is.
Sure, it's very good.
The most interesting statistic I found was that the average salary of a staffer in 72 or 74 was the same as the average salary of a lobbyist. And in that world, you're like, why would I ever be a lobbyist? Why not be a staffer? But now it's irresistible. And you put this ordinary good people, what we call good soul corruption here quite well. You say this mess was created by ordinary people responding logically to powerful incentives. So our focus shouldn't, in my view, be so much on whether they're evil or not. I don't think they are. I think they're ordinary. It should be focused on the incentives, because obviously that's what's going to drive any of us into this kind of behavior. Okay, now let's think about one particular part of this structure of this bill, and then I want to open it up to questions, because this is the part that struck me as most interesting about Dodd-Frank. So you remark, the lobbyists realize that their most effective play is going to be in the details of the legislation, and especially when they realize there is going to be a bill. Nobody's going to stop the bill. It no longer makes sense to try to fight to stop the bill. They're going to try to have some work done in the details of the legislation. And one of the most important parts of this legislation was the part that mandated re-regulation or regulation of derivatives. There was an important section which another hero in the story, I think Gary Gensler, slips in at the last minute to effectively force the CFTC, which he became chairman of.
He was already chairman.
I mean, he was chairman, right, but I'm sorry. The question is whether he will be chairman next year. But he's chairman of, and CFTC will get jurisdiction to then regulate derivatives.
Share jurisdiction.
Yeah, share with the SEC, right, which creates a big problem. But he's very proud of his achievement inside that legislation. But of course, the legislation, by its design, shifts a significant chunk of the regulatory work to regulations, not the actual statute. So you begin a process of regulating that the rules are going to have to be developed. And of course, as everybody remarks, the rules are delayed. Only a third has been enacted. 2/3 are past their deadline. But the one I want to focus on is the ones around these derivatives. Because the rule basically requires some re-regulation except for high-quality assets. And the latest round of the outcome of this regulatory fight, according to some estimates, is going to put 80% of these derivatives beyond regulatory control. On some, Alan Blinder thinks that for the class of mortgage securities, it will be 95% of mortgage securities that are not subject to regulatory control. All of this because for the last 2 years or of this regulatory process, lobbyists have been filling the halls of the regulators, pushing and pushing and pushing for this particular result, with the consequence that people like, I think, Gary Gensler feel like a huge part of the war has been lost, even though he won that initial important battle. Now, do you think that anybody was thinking about this as a strategy when they developed the Dodd-Frank? Like the really smart lobbyists said, here's how we win. 70% of the regulatory effect here we'll put into regulations, and then we will spend $750 million, which is basically what they spent in the first 2 years, lobbying to make sure those regulations are on our side. Is that a fair account of what happened, or do you think it was more accidental?
No, well, first of all, I correct you on one point. I don't think this is new. This has been going on for quite a long time. Right, regulation writing has been a very central part of the legislative process for the modern era. It's not a new development. And in fact, some of the participants think it's gone better this time than in some other cases. This notion that everything's going to escape is disputed, and I have not made an attempt personally to report this or get into it. But Amy Friend, now the general counsel of the Comptroller of Currency, says Alan Blinder is wrong. It won't be that bad by a long shot. She thinks it's pretty good. So we have to wait and see, and I don't feel competent. But this idea, who said this? Somebody in the Reagan administration. Oh, what's his name from Merrill Lynch, who was the Secretary of Treasury? Don, thank you.
Reagan. Yeah.
Don Reagan,
Yeah.
said, God, Washington is amazing. Nothing is ever settled. Well, it's true. And the pros know this and never give up and keep pushing. But, so this is more of a standard operating procedure than a departure, in my view, what's happened here. But I don't feel competent to judge the result of it yet.
Well,
but
okay,
the derivatives market is really different than it was, and that's important. We don't know, we lay people, what derivatives are, how they work, but they're trading instruments, they're very complicated. But the number of, they're all traded in the open now with very few exceptions. 5 years ago, none of them were traded in the open. It's a huge change. It isn't about regulation per se, it's about making the market work better. And it is working better. And that's really important. And that's not part of this debate that you're alluding to with your question.
Right. Well, this has been Gensler's big fight from the very beginning, his argument. And he's a very interesting character because he comes from Goldman Sachs originally, but then after being quite successful, then turns against, or at least the perception of Wall Street is, turns against Wall Street. And his basic argument, which doesn't sound so controversial to, economist types, I would think, is that the problem with the market of derivatives was that it was basically a cartel of obscure instruments that nobody except 6 people in the world understood. And that's what blew the world up. And the solution is to open it up and be a much more competitive, standardized market.
And, right. make people announce their prices, which they do now.
Right.
And that's a huge change.
Right. But that's the thing which the people in the derivatives industry, or at least the traditional 5 or 6 people in the derivatives industry, want to fight the most,
yes,
because it destroys their ability to make profit.
It destroys their markup.
Okay, so then you can't predict, or you won't predict, or you don't want to get into the business of figuring out what the percentage is. But if 70% of derivatives are exempted from these regulations, was it a success, or?
I can't, I'm not your guy. Get some guy from the business school to tell you. I don't know.
Well, but you can't back out that easily because you do think the legislation was a success. So I want to know what you mean by saying it was a success if it succeeded in regulating derivatives. I mean, it's one of the points that this was a pretty significant defeat for the derivatives traders, that this was in the law. But if 70% of it is taken back, then...
Yes, well, I don't think that's going to be the case, but I don't know enough to argue with you. But I think, what the bill is a success if it makes the financial markets more stable and more open and more competitive. And I think it does. But God, I'm a newspaper man. I don't know. I made a very deliberate choice. 2 of my Yale classmates are in the room. They made the same choice, not to follow our many Yale classmates who went to New York and got rich. So I've never lived in this world. I had to learn a lot about it to do this book, or try to learn a lot about it, but it's not something that I feel really an expert about.
So then let me bring back, just as a last point, one thing you are expert about. The thing that I hadn't focused on in this history that is really astonishing was the way the facts no longer were a constraint on anything that happened inside of the debate, right? So you recount again and again Republicans standing up on the floor of the House and the leader of the Republican in the Senate standing up and saying, this bill is going to legalize the bailouts, legalize the bailouts, legalize the bailouts. When in fact, what the bill is doing was exactly the opposite. It was forbidding bailouts in the traditional way. Now you could say, and I actually, in my heart of hearts, believe this, if we got into another crisis, those rules will be wiped away and there will be another bailout. But to say that the law was authorizing bailouts was just flat out not true. But as a journalist, Who was responsible for making America aware of the fact that this debate is framed around a fundamental falsehood? I mean, doesn't that, as a journalist who's seen the history of journalism, doesn't that trouble you as much as Congress, that somehow this message was just nowhere understood in the American public?
I saw a headline today on one of the many things that come into my iPhone. I can't remember where it's from, which is a big problem, I think, in modern life.
Mm-hmm.
Chuck Todd was quoted somewhere saying, "It's not our job to call out the Republicans when they say something untrue." Well, I think it is our job, and that really disturbs me. I don't know if what he said, it may be unfair to Chuck. I don't want to, but this is a real crisis for American journalism, and we have not risen to meet it very effectively.
Yeah.
Because it's a wonderful Pat Moynihan quote: "Everybody's entitled to their opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. You got to deal with the same set of facts."
Right. So
in American public life, this is no longer true. You come along and introduce your own set of facts, stick to them ferociously, and you never yield. That's just what happened here in this argument. And these guys have never given in. They've never admitted that they just made it up.
Yeah. Well, I love the way which you attempt to fight back against this. I'll quote one person without naming who it is, but this is your quote of this person reporting a speech on the floor of the House. "Madam Chair, last July an economist from Arizona State had determined that since the inception of the bailout nation in September of 2008, the federal government has taken ownership of 18% of our economy. And if President Obama gets his way and takes over the healthcare industry, that's another 18% of our economy, or 48%. Bracket, your bracket, somehow 18 plus 18 came out to 44, close bracket. Then if Obama and former Vice President Al Gore have their way and cause electricity rates to necessarily skyrocket by taking over the energy industry and imposing a national energy tax, that would mean the government taking over another 8% of the economy for a total of 54%. Now 48 plus 8 equals 54. So you did the rare thing of at least correcting the math of a member of Congress.
Let's do Socratic teaching here. Guess who? Anybody? Michelle Bachmann.
Okay, so thank you. Let's turn to the audience now and take some questions from the audience. Here's the one rule. There is a button in front of you, in front of that black thing, that you push when you speak. You don't have to get very close like this, but you push and it will pick up your voice. It's essential not so much that we hear, although it will help. It's essential so that the recording will pick up your voice, which will be important for people understanding what the question was. So I'm going to keep a cue. Yeah, for posterity.
Remember the great Swan and Flanders line.
Wherever
you're sitting is where you'll be on the recording.
I'll keep
Just
a cue.
Say, hello, posterity.
I'll keep a cue, but make sure I see you and I'll put you on a list. Let's start with Arthur.
So I thank you, I think, and this is an extremely depressing recounting, and I have absolutely no reason to doubt that it is as horrible as the two of you describe, or even more horrible. My question is whether there ever was a golden age. None of you used that phrase. One would hope that there was a golden age, because if there was a golden age, then we would at least have a direction. We'd know our way out. I suspect there never was a golden age, certainly not before the Voting Rights Act of '65, certainly not when you had the period throughout most of the 19th century when you had the old-style traditional corruption. Are we talking about a very, very narrow slice post-Watergate when the stars aligned just right to allow a certain kind of legislation to pass? Or are we simply talking about, I'm a yellow dog liberal Democrat, I'm not ashamed to say it, are we simply talking about that things go better when liberal Democrats are in charge and not otherwise, which may in fact be true, but is not particularly instructive?
I remind you of something called the war in Vietnam to undermine your argument. I think this is a really good, interesting question, which I thought a lot about in the first of these books, and again in the second. It seems to me that, your remark about the Voting Rights Act is apt, and I'm going to ignore it for a moment. I think there was a good time, which begins in 1933 and ends in 1978 approximately, where people who really cared about making a better country in both parties thought that the way to do that was to run for office, come to Washington, work it out, figure out what to do. But this is, if that's right, and we could have a long, interesting discussion about American history, about which I'm also not a great expert, but if that's accurate, roughly speaking, it's probably the only time since the founders when we had a lot of people well motivated, and still we had a lot of corrupt and lousy and racist and other bad people involved in the system. It's never ideal, shouldn't be, never could be. But this cultural change that's occurred in the last 30 years, 35 now, is bad, and there's no sign of it improving. On the contrary, it's getting worse. So personally, however, I should say, before someone asks me, I don't think this can go on like this. I remain a pretty optimistic person about the American experiment. I think we're in for some kind of discontinuity in the next decade or so, and maybe sooner, where people say, okay, the hell with this, we're doing it differently. And I could see a real change of some kind. And the first candidate for change that I see as a reporter is the Republican coalition of today, which is unstable and very much at risk, I think. And it could blow up. It could blow up in 3 weeks, literally. That doesn't mean it will, it just means it could. So, but I think, we're in a really bad place. It is a depressing picture. And I'm frustrated by the unwillingness of people in all walks of life to recognize that it is serious. We've become a totally apolitical society. We were never that political. Read de Tocqueville. He was impressed by our lack of political interest and engagement. But it's much worse now than it was when he was here. We're so busy entertaining ourselves and amusing ourselves and making money and so on. We just don't pay attention. I have a stockbroker in New York, very smart, nice woman who must be 49 years old, 50 years old. She keeps talking to me about what I ought to be buying and what I ought to be doing. And I say, Stephanie, are you aware that the government of the United States is going to shut down sometime in the next month, and we're going to probably go into default and have a huge financial disruption? Oh, she said to me on the phone 6 weeks ago, how could that happen? They can't be that stupid, can they? But this is repeated. It's in Washington, too. There are lots of people in Washington who say, this can't happen, can it? It can. Stay tuned. So
but even 78 is a little too pessimistic. I mean, the significant acts in the Reagan administration are bipartisan acts. And the fundamental change of the tax code comes because Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan sit down and
Bill
have a real
Bradley,
deal.
yeah.
And so there's even the spirit of compromise there, and that's the way they frame it. So your second book, when you say it's Gingrich that begins it, so 94 that really begins the radical change, is a broader answer to what's going on.
It is.
Right here first, and then keep. Yeah.
Thanks. Is that me?
Yep.
Thanks. So you mentioned earlier about the role of party discipline.
Raise your hand. I don't see you.
Hi.
Oh, good. Sorry.
Great.
Thanks.
I'm sorry. You should introduce yourself when you. Right.
Sure. Jennifer Sheets-Giventon. I'm a fifth-year PhD student in psychology and a former lab fellow at the Safra Center. So you mentioned about the role of party discipline in making the kind of active forming policy, quality policy, worse because it was not allowing members to come together as individuals, as kind of citizens to talk to each other about bills. But I can see the effect that has on polarization. But I'm not quite sure about the effect that has on corruptibility, because back when I was at the center, what we talked about was how when it's down to a bunch of individuals, actually, a load of lonesome entities are a lot easier to corrupt than one body. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on, if the influence of money happens just at the party level, perhaps it's easier to police than if it's happening at the level of every single individual, to the extent that each individual is completely free to make their own call.
Tell me where your accent is from.
Ireland.
Yeah. We have both. We corrupt parties with big money and we corrupt individuals with big money. We play it all ways. So I don't think you can distinguish now in our system. There's a fascinating story on the front page of the New York Times this morning about Chris Christie raising hundreds of thousands of dollars from people who, under New Jersey law, he cannot take money from. So he doesn't take the money. The Republican National Governors Association takes the money and gives it to him. Good. That's where we are now. So it's, I mean, I take your point, but I don't think we're so messed up now. We get it from all directions.
Great, right here? Yeah, so you push the button, right? Yeah. They push it at the front of the, no, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Hi, Bill Ostrander from San Luis Obispo, California. My question for you is more about the solution, since we've clearly seen that money is corrupting politics as a corrosive influence. The question I have for you is, do you think it's possible through the legislative process to get ourselves out of this? And would that be through an amendment or through immediate legislative action that could be taken by Congress?
Professor Lessig did yeoman's service in his book, wrestling with this. It's a really hard problem. Reporters have this luxury of saying we discover and expose problems, we don't solve them. This is a cop-out for sure, but I've been using it for 50 years, and you're not going to cure me of it tonight. But I do think we're in a real pickle now because of the Citizens United decision, where it's hard to see. Sometimes, of course, Supreme Courts turn on themselves and overrule Supreme Courts. In fact, Citizens United is such a case. So that could happen. Or we could try the constitutional amendment role. That's very scary to me once we start down that path. But that's my kind of conservatism. I just don't want to open up those doors. Maybe we'll have to. But this is now a huge problem. And interestingly, we've developed already a large class of politicians who've learned to live with it. You and I suspect, well, I don't know you, but I know me, I couldn't possibly do what these people do. It's so dirtying. It's just really, it's appalling. But sure.
You know, in Kennedy's majority opinion, he talked about the absence of corruption or the appearance of corruption.
Yes.
In their ruling that afforded this enormous amount of money, $933 million in the last election. How does somebody that smart get it or not get it when everybody else in this room seems to understand?
I've thought about this. I've thought about trying to write about it. I have a wonderful friend called Walter Dellinger. You must know Walter, former Solicitor General, very smart lawyer. I just had this discussion with Walter a few days ago. I said, I want to write a piece about the remote distance of the Supreme Court from reality. And the Kennedy decision was where I'd start, literally. Because his sense of the inner workings of American electoral politics, I would say, are matched by my 4-year-old grandson. I mean, he's just a total naive. And Walter said, you're right about Kennedy, he's a naive, but the other guys, they knew exactly what they were doing. And I fear he's right, especially Alito and Scalia and Roberts. They wanted to level the playing field from their perception. They wanted to empower corporate money to help their side win. Now, that's a deeply cynical view of our Supreme Court. I can't prove it, neither can Walter, but there are a lot of smart lawyers in Washington who believe it. And it's very troubling. But this is, with those guys there, how to fix this becomes really, really hard. Really hard.
Okay, I see in the blue shirt right here.
Tyler Creighton. My question is in reference to what Professor Lessig was talking about with Dodd-Frank giving a lot of power to regulators to come up with what actually the bill is going to do. And in your book, you talk a lot about how lobbyists exert their power through campaign finance donations. That's one of their sort of leverage points. In looking at lobbyists in lobbying regulatory bodies, what is their leverage point? Because campaign contributions don't exist in that relationship. So is it just solely based on their presence there, or is there something else that allows them to unduly influence the process?
Well, the key word there is unduly. This is not a new development, as I said. All big modern bills have left the nitty-gritty to the regulators, to the regulation writers. You could not write the Dodd-Frank regulations in congressional committees. It would take years. It would be a hopeless process, not least because so few people in the Congress have the expertise that would make it work. In this book, I estimate generously that the number of members of the House and Senate in the 110th Congress that passed the bill who are real experts on the subject matter could fit quite easily on the 25-member roster of a Major League Baseball team. There just aren't many people who know this stuff. All the regulators who are writing these regulations are knowledgeable. Many of them are former participants. So it's a very different world. This is not probably what the founders had in mind, but they have a lot of things that have happened in our society are things that the founders did not have in mind. This is one of our constant struggles. But they don't have leverage in the sense that you're suggesting. They're doing this by argumentation, and by practicality is the best argument that they ever bring. How could we ever do that? The Volcker Rule is a wonderful example. The Volcker Rule says a bank cannot trade its own money, proprietary funds, speculatively. It can't take risks with its own corpus of capital. I heard Volcker, who I got to know quite well, he's an important source for my book. I heard him say in a Senate Banking Committee hearing, when asked, what's proprietary trading, by a bright young senator, he said, like Justice Potter Stewart said of pornography, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And he was very smug about this. He still is, Volcker. Come on, everybody knows what proprietary trading is. Well, they don't. It's really complicated because of the financial structure of modern banks, because of the client relationships they develop now with investing institutions. I won't bore you, but it's really complicated. So the Volcker Rule, 2.5 years later, 3 years later, is not written, and it's still a matter of great contention. And the arguments that the industry brings to the regulators about the Volcker Rule are all about the practical consequences. If you define it as X, here's the bad effects Y, Q, and R will happen. If you define it as Y, Z, L, and T will happen. You haven't figured this out yet. They keep throwing sand in their eyes. But all these things are real. It's not as though there are clear, simple answers. There aren't. So it's a very interesting process. It's a reflection of the complexity of the world that we live in. I wanted to make a point about this. You talked about Bill Gates and the length of bills. The reason the Dodd-Frank bill is so long, and you can read it and see this, is that well more than 3/4 of it are devoted to the provisions of existing laws that it amends, alters, or repeals. Because there are so many laws on the books now. We go down to the library in this institution and look at the U.S. Code, volume after volume after volume. You pass a big bill like this, which touches on a lot of things, and you have to amend one thing right after another, as it does over 2,000 pages. So we have created a monstrously complicated society, and it's really hard to deal with it. And it may just, it may collapse on us at some point.
Yeah, but so I want to push back a little bit. First, we're not going to be able to resolve this, but I will assert, and because I'm the professor, it has to be true, that the percentage of significant decisions punted in this bill relative to other major legislation is higher. Like the opportunity for undermining significant policy choices is greater. Now that's a hard thing to claim, and we can just bracket whether it's true or not. But the other point about this is it's just not the case that in its nature the regulation has to be complex. After all, Glass-Steagall was 2 sentences long, the relevant provision of Glass-Steagall that was eventually eliminated by a series of changes that brought about the deregulation in this context. The choice to regulate in a incredibly complicated way
was deliberate.
Is deliberate, and one reason why people like people who employ lobbyists want regulation in an incredibly complicated way is that they then have the opportunity to place their people in the, okay. Now, what's the influence? What's the leverage? So you say, you're right, there's no campaign contributions. One of Jack Abramoff's greatest passages in his book is, he is describing the most effective technique that he had as a lobbyist, which was to walk into a Senate office and say, what are you doing in 2 years? And the chief of staff would say, well, I don't know, Jack. And he would say, from that moment, he said, want you to look me up after you're finished. And he says, from that moment on, I owned that chief of staff, and not a single dollar had changed hands. And one of the most important dynamics in the regulatory and the executive is the revolving door here. So you want to be in a position where you have a great opportunity. You're not going to be creating enemies. Now, not everybody. There are certainly heroes, just like there are heroes in Congress. I think you think Barney Frank is a hero in this story. I think Chris Dodd is playing. These are, well, the book sounds less than you're saying right now, but okay. But the point is there are great people, but they're just not the norm. And the question is whether by shifting it into the norm, that's what it creates. Ron Suskind.
Hi, Bob.
Oh, it's you. What are you doing here?
You need to push the button, Ron. You're going to be recorded.
I co-conspire with Lessig here at the Center for Ethics, yeah. I think you're more optimistic than I was in Confidence Man, but I want to talk about Paul Volcker because I think he's an asset for both your book and my book, and I think an asset for the country, especially when you get one of these, I dare say, older guys who have seen it all and seem to be free to say what others might not. Volcker sort of is like a bull elephant trumpeting to the herd before he goes down. And one of the things he said, which I thought was very incisive, was he looked at the philosophy of both, certainly Larry Summers, Tim Geithner, others as well, though, the first do no harm, Hippocratic risk, they call it, which seems to define so much of the proceedings here. God forbid you should harm us. God forbid you should harm Goldman Sachs and its extraordinary proprietary trading operations, or any number of things. Well, Volcker says that Obama ends up being cautious, being a new president. And I'm going to ask you at the end how much you feel Obama might have, let's say, not been helpful in pushing forward some of what Barney and Chris were doing, because that was something that was happening in terms of where Obama fit in this equation. But Volcker says, this notion of first do no harm, the fact is, if you start there, you will end up doing nothing. The fact is, good legislation, just like Glass-Steagall when it happens, does harm. It does harm to interests. And that's why it's 2 sentences. The philosophy back then is figure it out. If you have to fire people, fire them. If you're going to shrink to half your size, that's not my problem. But ultimately, in these discussions, that does become the problem of the government and the regulators and the Gary Genslers of the world. Now, Gensler's a hero in my book, too. The guy's been fighting a one-man battle against a tent city of lobbyists in front of the Commodities Futures Trading Commission. And he has not, at the end of the day, he's pretty close to Larry. I talk to Gary all the time, and he talks about gazelles being killed before they get to the water hole. Well, there's a lot of dead gazelles on the savannah. So I guess my question is, did you think in your estimation that maybe Obama and Barney and Chris may have missed opportunities in those early days, the spring of '09, when the crisis was so ripe, and you were even getting Republicans coming in saying, let's do something bipartisan here. We've got a lot of harvesting to do on the right as well as the left politically, if we do something quick and we do something tough. And I guess my question is, why do you think that didn't happen when there were plenty of people who saw it, even in the administration, not to move swiftly, to use the crisis most effectively? And where was Obama in so much of this, in terms of the only person who could provide the top-down leadership to guide this thing, as opposed to what he often did, which is throw it to Barney and Chris and say, I've got my big principles, you figure out the rest, which is heaven for the lobbyists to hear.
I don't want to bore the crowd with our inside game here, but I don't agree with everything you said about what happened. But let me start with the principle, which is important, and I write it very explicitly in this book. All the players, Dodd, Frank, Geithner, Obama, Summers, all decided the same thing in those first months of 2009, which was we are not going to try to create a new structure for the American financial system. We're going to save the one we've got. Nobody disagreed with that. Nobody challenged it. And that's where the chances were missed. But it was unanimous. There was nobody arguing the other side that I was aware of. I mean, there are a lot of people in the world arguing the other side, but not of the principles in Washington.
There were some that were, but they were overwhelmed.
Who?
Frankly, the president wanted to break up the banks in that March meeting. He wanted to break up Citibank. He talked about breaking up the major banks. He says, I want proposals on that.
Yes.
Ultimately, he doesn't get those proposals in real time, and at that point, the situation moves quickly. But the president actually, in that March period, was thinking very clearly about, I want to be like Sweden and not Japan, and let's be active. But ultimately, his skilled advisors helped shape the policy to move in a different
I'm not sure that's right.
Well, he said
What happened. Barney wasn't interested in that from the beginning. And Barney's not some apologist for Wall Street. It was just his judgment that this is going to be really hard to do, and we're not going to make it impossible by going too far, by taking on too much. And I know this, I mean, the fun of what I did, this is not a book selling session as I'm usually used to, but I want everybody to understand this book is not a policy tome. It's not written for wonks. It's a story. It's a fun story about what really happened. And what happened was an attempt to use political power to mitigate a bad situation quickly and efficiently, based on really the instincts of a few guys and gals who'd lived through this world for a long time and thought they knew what a sensible course of action would be. Gene Roslanowick, Barney's staff director, who interestingly, just a footnote, most people in Washington today become chairman. One of their few really exercisable powers is to choose their top aides, because those are the really important people that make things happen. Barney did that in the case of a member of this audience, Mr. James Siegel, raise your hand, former member of the Massachusetts Assembly with Barney, who was his most important political aide in this process. But Gene Roslanowick, he inherited from a guy called LaFalce, John LaFalce from Buffalo, Barney's predecessor as senior Democrat on the committee. And amazingly to his colleagues and to me, Barney did not pick his own person. He liked Jean, he knew how smart she was. He picked Jean, and she was there. And she tells me that in, what's the bad bill about the banks? The three members, Jimmy, help me out, the three. Yeah, say it again. Graham Leach Bliley, thank you kindly. Left much more to the regulators than Dodd-Frank did. And she was involved in writing both. I didn't check this, but I trust Jean. But I think radical change was taken off the table at the outset. If Obama flirted with it, maybe he flirted with it, but he was talked out of it. And I'm intrigued with the implicit thesis behind that argument is that Obama didn't really agree with Larry Summers and the people around him of that ilk. But look what we've just learned about how badly he wanted Summers to be the chairman of the Fed, which he's obviously been blocked from doing, which is interesting. But there's no question Dodd-Frank is a conservative bill, and the chance to do what FDR did was lost, for sure.
So you've been teed up. You're next.
A couple of things. I think that Obama came in with health care as his priority much more than financial reform. That was part of the problem. Second...
This is Mr. Siegel, who I just mentioned. He's quite a good guy.
Second, you talk about legislative gridlock, and I don't know how you can talk about it without mentioning the abuse of the filibuster at this point, which gives incredible power to the minority of the minority. Senate already gives power to the minority with states with very little population. Now, every vote is much more important when you can get 41 to stop it, and that deeply affected the bill. It deeply affected the derivatives part of the bill, and it deeply affected the banking part of the bill, because you could not do anything very radical or dramatic because a minority could kill it. And then the other thing that hasn't been mentioned yet today is the redistricting, where you have almost all safe seats with just a number in the middle, so that it's going to be very difficult again, because Republicans with safe seats and Democrats with safe seats only owe to their right and left wing respectively, and really not to the center. And both of those affect legislation in very significantly, but particularly the Senate could stop anything. And I think Barney, who is, if nothing, a realist, and he was invested intellectually in this, but not emotionally in this, as opposed to, say, housing or social issues. And I think he could count votes in the House, and also saw what Chris Dodd had to do in the Senate.
Thanks, Jim. It's a good point.
But I want to make sure we don't lose the link here, because it's absolutely right. The filibuster is a powerful tool that's been abused. I would agree with that. But it's important to recognize that it's being abused in part because it's an effective tool to flush money into the system. And you talk about the way in which McConnell, right around the time that they're coming around its bill, races to New York to fundraise around this bill. And all he can threaten is filibuster, right? So it's the point that the filibuster is giving them an opportunity, and they need to exercise it if it's going to be a credible point. The Nation had this wonderful piece about a lobbyist firm that had on their webpage, until the Nation's article came out, bragging about the fact that they could basically buy a filibuster for you. Like, if you wanted to stop something, they would exercise the power to use the filibuster to stop it. So it becomes a tool in the economy of influence that you're describing. Do you want to follow up to that, or?
Yeah, I just want to say both parties are collusive in this, and the senators, there were filibusters basically used to prevent civil rights, but then they've now colluded that you don't have to really filibuster, you just have to say I'm going to filibuster, and that's the big difference. If they had to filibuster, then the American public would see what was really going on in that regard and what was being stopped, and also there'd be much fewer. But both parties didn't want to be as going to the mattresses sort of is what they had to do, because they had to be there for quorum calls. So they both have colluded in this, and I think it's a huge mistake, and I think it really should be tackled.
Mr. George.
To what degree do we get the politics that we vote for? So at the beginning of your...
Approximately 100%.
At the beginning of your talk, you were talking about, the Senate lunchroom and Georgetown dinners, greasing the wheels. I think for a lot of people, they hear those things and they actually react negatively to that. It's not a romantic thing of the past. It's something that's actually putting distance between what constituents want and what representatives do. And similarly, Americans often vote for divided government specifically to gum up the works. So how much of the problem is money and the politicians versus the actual preferences of the electorate?
Well, this is a long and interesting discussion, but I just make a central point for me. The biggest problem is indifference and laziness. People do not pay attention, do not hold accountable their elected officials, do not know what's going on. This is a really serious cultural problem. It's not a new problem in America. I think arguably it's worse today than it's ever been before, but that's a speculative statement, to be sure. But if people don't if public figures think they can get away with misbehavior of various kinds that's beneficial to them, they'll do it. If we can't hold them accountable, then they're not going to be on their best behavior. They're not going to be concerned about their best behavior. So this is a big national cultural problem, and I don't know the answer to it.
Jay? So can you push the button? Yeah.
I'm Jay Halfon, an attorney that represents advocacy groups. A couple of quick observations. I think we have let the executive branch off the hook in the conversation about whether or not lobbyists influence the regulatory process. I have seen in the Obama administration just recently where White House political staff dig deep into the regulatory process to influence the outcome, and the executive branch brings in far more political contributions than Congress ever will. And so I think that's an important consideration. We consider this. Two more observations. When you talk about Newt Gingrich encouraging members of the, in this case, member of the House, to stay out of Washington, while that does reduce collegiality among members, it also means that there's less contact with lobbyists as well. You may differ, but I put that out for thought. And finally, you talk about that golden era between 33 and 76. And one thing that I think is interesting, if you at least go back pre-World War II, members, at least of the House, where people weren't always millionaires, actually had outside jobs. The restrictions on income were very, very different. There were lawyers in the House who went back to practice. Sessions were shorter, and people did actually spend more time in the districts and actually work for a living at some point. Well, I know this is probably entirely theoretical and would probably never happen because Congress would have to make it happen, but do you think there would be any improvement going back to a situation where actually we had shorter sessions, low salaries, not livable salaries, where actually members were allowed once again to have outside income and interact in a community, have to purchase their own health insurance? I know that would lead to a lot more millionaires potentially, but maybe not so much in the House. I'd just be curious about your observations of those 3 points.
Well, it's already happened in the House. There are many too many millionaires in the House for my taste. And the problem here is you're assuming if we went back to 19th century rules, we'd get 19th century results. But I think we are unmistakably in the 21st century and can't escape it. It's just, this is, I'm as frustrated as you, but I don't think we can, that's a fix. The problem here of who wants to be a member and why is really intriguing. And it's a ripe area for more scholarly work, I think. But the Senate is overwhelmingly now wealthy people. And the House is about half very wealthy people. It's not an easy thing to fix. And we have this top-heavy country now where the differences are so dramatic in wealth and time available and things like that to play politics. It's a different country. And I think we need to do more academic work figuring that out and explaining it. Because things change profoundly, and the old fixes don't work. I often wonder what some of my heroes from the past would think if they could be transported here to look around and see what's going on. They'd be amazed, just amazed. It's a stunning change. I don't think we're not all that good at seeing ourselves straight in the mirror, but we've changed. We're different.
This has been wonderful. I understand since Jeff Bezos bought the Post, it only takes half a click to buy your book on Amazon right now.
My salary has tripled. Oh no!
I'm incredibly grateful that you would come and talk to us like this, and thank you very much for the discussion.